Okay, boom. So, um, what are we talking about today? Actually, first of all, feel free to introduce yourself for the new people. Oh, you're still on mute. Go on.
Yeah, sure. So I am John, a 26-year-old, 20-something-year-old. Um, Recently graduated uni, studied history and economics at the University of Manchester. And after kind of treading water in this pandemic like everyone else, I'm looking to start my graduate job in management consulting pretty much very soon, like this Monday. And
Nice.
my interests outside consulting span quite a few things, um, whether it's kind of tech to arts and like the arts, whether it's like film, music, books, like fiction, non-fiction, writing, something I like to do. And within that, creative non-fiction and poetry. Also, although it doesn't look like it, I do support Liverpool. This is just a nice, it's just
Fair
a
play.
nice thought. Um, and yeah, that's more or less me in a nutshell.
Cool beans. Ironically, I never do any intros, and I'm probably not going to today. But
Okay.
anyway, we had a cool conversation quite recently. Well,
Yeah.
a good conversation I thought would be useful for other people to be able to hear some of that. I know you were sharing with me some insights from some books you were reading. What was the first one? Something about
Yeah.
tennis.
Yes. So the book was a book called The Inner Game of Tennis by Timothy Galway. Just some kind of background on him. He was so he is from America, and as you know, with the American system, people get kind of scholarships to go sports scholarships to go to college or university, and I think he picked up tennis as his kind of scholarship. And after he graduated, he took some time out from tennis to kind of explore other things, but eventually came back and became what's called a tennis pro, which just means a tennis coach, um, in I guess in our language. And through his own tennis playing and his coaching of tennis, he discovered or kind of managed to understand something he calls the inner game of tennis, and which just goes to this relationship between outward performance and the inner battle, internal mechanisms of how your mind works, of how your mind links to the way you perform.
Hmm.
It's difficult to kind of summarize everything into a neat sentence, but if I was to try, I would say it's about quieting the mind to approach an activity, a learning, an experience in the art of like relaxed concentration, and don't get in the way, and don't let your mind get in the way of yourself and your performance.
Mm. So, I mean, I guess the core of the discussion we were having is kind of operating at your peak and how do you like
Mhm.
perform at your best consistently.
Yeah,
And I know you were sharing some things from that book as well with
yeah,
regards to that.
yeah. So as I being at your peak. So from the book, it goes the main things that he looked to try to show was that basically you need to don't be your harshest critic, if that makes sense. So what can happen is that we allow our critical self to get in the way of us performing. So when we make mistakes, we judge those mistakes, first of all, as bad, not just as neutral observations. And we go from that is bad to I am bad, to I am terrible, to I am bad at this. And that can become a negative cycle, a negative loop,
Right.
that can continue and hinder you. So you want to almost trust yourself, trust your unconscious mind, trust your natural human ability to learn, to develop, to observe, and then to grow. And then there are different kind of aspects to this, but the whole point is don't just focus on the outward performance, the results, the outcomes, and don't attach your identity, your your self-esteem to those outside values. Also be aware that it's not just an external game with results and outcomes, but there's an internal game. So there's a reason why you're playing the game or doing the activity or involved in whatever experience you're in. Are you trying to do it for fun, for enjoyment, to feel in the zone, to feel energized? Or is it just about the outcome, the win, to take the kind of sporting metaphor?
Fair. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of so Adam Grant. I'm not sure if you come across his books. You possibly have, because he writes loads of amazing books, like originals. I think Give and Take is also by him. But essentially, I think it might not have been in a book, but it's from him. He was talking about
Sure.
making a differentiation between optimal performance and typical performance, and how we
Okay.
measure both and how we measure people against both.
Mm.
And in that example, maybe you would look at comedians as people that we measure them by their optimal performance.
Yeah.
Like, it's about how good you are at your peak. When you're at your very best, how good you are is how we regard you in that field. Whereas as a
Mm.
teacher, nobody really cares how good you are on your very best day. What matters more
Sure.
is your typical performance. It's much better that you are good consistently, or it's better to be B plus consistently than to have one A plus day and the rest are C days. Similarly, if you're a chef, or if you're someone that essentially needs to deliver consistently, day to day, night to night,
Yeah.
the rules are different, and what counts as performance, what counts as the fulfillment of that professionalism differs as
Yeah.
well.
I was gonna just jump in here. I think one of the things that from hearing you talk, it seems as if the difference between the two is maybe a concept of spectacle. So what is a spectacle? What is entertainment? What has audiences? So the things that they both, have results. They both have people who demand the services or the activities. But one, there's a spectacle. There's a box time limited window to experience optimal, or to admire, to engage with optimal performance. Whereas you're not gonna, I always think of, like, football games, or just even just any kind of shows of pinnacle sportsmanship. You're not in a classroom, like looking at a teacher and waiting for him to, answer, to show his great lesson plan, and out there just cheering him on, with bated breath. Is he gonna He's gonna give them
Yeah.
a learning point, a learning object. It's there's no there's no spectacle to that sense. So maybe the things that we count as entertainment, and maybe there might also be a link in terms of economically as well, that the things that we look for optimal performance in and value that, they may value that as the way we measure their performance might also be the things we value on an economic or commercial basis as well.
Yeah. But then simultaneously, from an internal perspective, maybe there is also a valid choice. Maybe as a teacher, for example, if you're not the world's best teacher, and you're probably not going to be the world's best teacher, perhaps you derive more value from knowing that there was one class in 1996 that you touched immeasurably, and that
Yeah,
class will remember you forever, and
yeah.
everyone else probably won't. In the same way, even looking at writing as an example, there's some
Mhm,
writers that are hugely prolific, and everything
mhm.
they write is pretty good. It might
Yeah.
not be the best thing you've ever read, but they're writing consistently, they're writing really good.
Mm.
I think, I don't want to downgrade John Grisham as an example, but he's someone that's written so many novels, and they're all great, but they're all at a very consistent level. But then you
Yeah,
also get some people that have had one hit wonders in a way, and for
yeah,
some, that is enough. J.K. Rowling wrote one great series.
yeah,
The rest of her books, I can't speak for them, but the
yeah,
Harry Potter series,
yeah.
for how long it's lived, for everything that it's been able to produce,
Mm.
maybe that one hit is enough. And so I think there's an extent to which maybe you can make a conscious decision about whether you would prefer. I think it's David Perel that talks about
Yeah,
how he chooses in terms of the content delivery that he does, whether you want
yeah.
kind of A plus quality
Mm.
and B plus consistency, or B plus quality and A plus consistency. And I think for
Mm.
him, he'd much rather be consistent than every single thing he writes has to be the very best he's ever written. So I guess
Yeah,
he would be focusing more on his prime, or optimal peak rather
Sure.
than a typical peak. And so I think there is some level of individualism there where you can make some
Yeah.
distinctions.
What I would say is that as the performer, I think first of all, just to go back to your teacher point, I think even for professions or spheres of life where you are judged by your typical performance, that doesn't preclude or exclude the fact that you may have moments of optimal performance which you value as a performer and which you cherish as a performer.
Mm.
And then I think the second point to make then is you the way you aim, maybe how you aim for optimal performance will condition your typical performance. And for some people, not reaching the optimal performance or doubting that they won't reach their optimal performance means they perform sporadically. For example,
Mm.
like only performing when inspired or only performing when they have the optimum
Right.
motivation
Because you
for it.
have this mental constraint that every time you write or every time you perform, every time you produce, it has to be the best. And so when you feel as though it's not going to be the best, then you will not perform.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
and I think Seth Godin in the practice talks about the need for consistency, not just performance or practice when you're inspired. Then it's not practice; it's
Yeah.
just, I guess, a hobby at this point.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think if anything, we can take the two concepts and say, if you want to perform closer to your optimal performance the majority of the time, you will have to be willing to undertake typical practice that doesn't always reach those high standards.
Yeah.
If you were to take Soft Godin and kind of apply his idea of the practice and layer it on top of the typical optimal like dichotomy.
I agree. I think you also touched on something important there as well, in terms of, well, talking about practice from another lens, in terms of preparation. And I think there's an Oprah quote. I don't know if it's actually originally hers,
Oh, yeah,
but essentially saying that success is where preparation meets opportunity. I think
yeah.
there's this aspect of serendipity that is often overlooked as well in achieving success, particularly if you're talking about optimal success. I think that there's a lot that happens below the surface. So, for example, let's say in Silicon Valley or within startup fields or within many professional fields, you have people that have consistently put in work in terms of preparation day after day after day for a prolonged period of time,
Yeah.
which can eventually compound and result in astronomical success. And then people only see that part. And that is what is taken as your optimal performance. And that is your peak. Whereas the rest of it doesn't count for much in the same way.
Yeah, and well, the reason it doesn't count is because it's below the surface. It's what happens when someone who is a spectator assesses the performance of a performer. Like only the performer has the general knowledge of their typical performance under the surface before the moment for spectacle, the moment, the opportunity to kind of show or to perform. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And what do you think about the importance of preparing for serendipity as well?
I I was actually going to reference a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. He talks about success. If anything, his book is actually a Debbie Downer. I think I originally bought the book in the hopes that I'll be inspired towards more success. And whilst it did do that to an extent, his point more was to show that certain contextual structures provide opportunities and serendipity that allows people like for Bill Gates, who literally had access to a computer club in his private school with computers that many schools, children his age did not have access to. And he was walking distance away from the local university computer lab. Just as a quick example of serendipity
Mm.
and how those serendipitous structures and opportunities allow people to then practice, to develop, and perform in a way that they become um, outliers. But I think, like, remind me of the original question before I got taken to the side.
I think that kind of answers it in a way. But the part that I'd add to that is, so I wrote about privilege in my newsletter not long ago, and
Yeah.
I was covering, and I've probably talked about it in some other spaces as well, but essentially talking about this idea of differentiating between manufactured friction and natural friction. Natural
Oh,
friction being resource allocation, and
sure.
manufactured friction being, sorry, resource availability versus resource allocation. And so
Mm,
resource availability is a lot like what you're describing in terms of, okay, Bill Gates was born essentially in the right place at the right time to be able to create what he created. And then you also have people that might be on the other side of the spectrum where, because of gentrification, they might be pushed out of a particular area.
yeah.
Because of implicit bias, they might not be selected for a particular role. Because
Mm,
of decisions by the government, maybe they don't build libraries in their area, or maybe the local after school clubs are shut down, things like that. So there's a lot of people that suffer from friction. Whereas if you have low friction, you're going to be naturally in areas of higher opportunity and higher serendipity.
yeah.
So I definitely think that that corresponds with the point you were making. But I also do think that there's a flip side to it as well, because I also
Mm,
believe that there's a large extent to which we can make our own luck. And I think that that is something that's frequently underrated.
mm,
Because I'm thinking of two studies. One, which was relatively simple. Essentially, they sent some people into a room,
mm,
and in that room, there's a book. And I think they had to read the book, and if they read it, they would get a reward. But
sure.
on one of the first pages of the book, maybe like page 2 or 3,
Mm,
there's a note in the book that says, "This is a trick. Don't keep reading. Just stop here."
okay.
And the people that had self-identified as not being lucky people
Yeah.
stopped there. The people that self-identified as believing that they were lucky people and believing just that they would find luck wherever they went,
Wow.
they kept reading, and there was money in the book. So
Really.
that's one example of a study. There was another study which I think is even more powerful as an example of this, where I think it was like a cafe essentially, and very similar in the setup, in terms of you have some people that self-identify as not being lucky, you have some people that identify as being lucky. You send them all into this cafe. Inside
Mm,
this cafe, they've planted, and the only task they were given is to go there and buy a coffee, come back. That's all.
mm, yeah.
But inside the shop, they had planted a stranger, and that stranger was tasked with, if had the ability to offer them a business opportunity if asked. And
Mm,
so again, you have the results that the people who identified as not being lucky kept to themselves, ordered their coffee, left the shop, done.
mm,
That's all. The people that
yeah.
identified, self-identified as people that believed that they were lucky, ended up having conversations with the person serving them, ended up having conversations with this random stranger that's also ordering coffee, end up being offered these
Yeah.
business opportunities, other opportunities. And obviously that's within a controlled environment, but you can
Yeah.
easily see how that extrapolates out into wider life, where I think there are people that, and again, maybe you can talk about how privilege might play a part in that as well. But I do
Mm,
think there's something to be said for the extent to which believing that you can go out and create those opportunities for yourself can result in those things happening just by the acts that you're liable to take as a result. So the more you
yeah.
believe that this is possible, the more you engage in those kinds of conversations, the more you develop opportunities.
So I think what I would say to that is it sounds as if a personal belief system, character traits, and I guess an openness to certain things all combine to, I guess, create the luck that that these self-identifying lucky people created. And
Mm.
it's interesting to explore further, maybe in a further study or just even interviewing the participants. Where does this self-identifying lucky come from? What
Yeah.
is the root of that? And is there a particular personality type, etc.? And just to throw in another book here, Napoleon Hill wrote a book called Think and Grow Rich,
Mm.
and one of the things in that book and other books of that kind of ilk, as in books which kind of focus on the the thought life of success, and they would kind of say, well, if you know fundamentally believe in your success and have a very potent sense of ambition, then you become more attuned, more aware to things that will push you in that way or give you opportunities, etc. If it's constantly on your mind that this is your goal, this is your aspiration, then you become more kind of mentally aware and like aware in other senses too of things that will drive you towards that. I mean, I guess it's almost like, have you ever had it when you're contemplating a problem,
Mm.
business problem, what have you, and it's on your mind a lot? Then you take your mind off it, and then as you're just doing something else, you stumble upon something which helps or supports. It's like your
Yeah.
mind does this mental thing of scanning subconsciously for things that are on your mind.
Yeah, Cal Newport talks about that in his book. I think it's Deep Work, the difference between like focused thinking and diffuse thinking, and the fact that
Nice.
by taking yourself away from some of those things, you're able to ruminate in the background and think about things in different ways, and your subconscious can put pieces together.
Mm,
Going back one step to what you were saying in terms of just very quickly,
mm,
like where does that belief or self-identification as being lucky come from? I do
yeah.
think to a large extent it's going to be self-reinforcing. All you do, you realistically you only need to believe it once. If
Mm,
you one time believed that you were lucky, and if you took a chance and you put yourself out there, something good would happen, and something good happened, that would be a self-reinforcing belief that actually
yeah.
the last time I did X, this is what happened. In the
Mhm,
future I will do X again. And
mm,
so I think that is frequently what happens, where the likelihood of you putting yourself out there and continuing to do those things, if you take more shoots, if you take more shots,
shots, yeah.
you'll make more hits. And so
Yeah.
the more frequently you're likely to do that, the more frequently you're likely to have results. And then
Mm,
that again just f- closes the loop and makes you believe that actually I should just keep doing it. Whereas if you were just missing, if you were just throwing clankers,
yeah.
maybe you would stop, or maybe you continue. I think there was
Mm,
another, I think it was a study, but I'm not going to bother trying to hash it
yeah.
up.
Sure,
But
sure.
the essence was that oh, I really wish I'd remembered the full thing, but the essence was that there's a lot of people that essentially stop at a particular place. I think it was something to do with maths actually, and
Okay.
so they deconstructed people's maths results, and the essence was saying that the people that did better on maths equations are the people that spent longer on it. And so
Yeah.
actually they had this assumption that, oh, Chinese people are better than maths because just
Mm,
naturally they're better at maths, but
okay.
actually maybe it's some cultural upbringing related things, but they were statistically just more likely to spend more time on each individual sum. And so what
Mm,
happens is if you push through the barriers
yeah.
of you're not getting it at first and you spend longer on it,
Mm,
eventually you get it. And if eventually you get it and you apply that for all of the sums, you get a higher grade. And so in
yeah.
the end, you have people that end up getting higher grades, but it's not because they were necessarily inherently smarter, but it's because they were
Mm.
willing to spend longer on each problem.
So just to bring that back full circle, it's almost you could say there are people who are inherently luckier than other people, but either through experience or through a subconscious reinforcing kind of self-fulfilling loop, they have developed things, a willingness to be more open to luck and to things that will
Mm.
make them lucky, almost.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to give a personal example, ironically, I just thought of it because I was thinking about when we were talking about peak performance. Derrick Rose is probably a good example of someone that is remembered as a great basketball player because he was a high peak performance. He was the MVP, I think, in 2009, 2010, that
Mm.
NBA season. But his peak lasted about 2 years. He's barely played since then, or not very much. And I was actually in some of the Adidas adverts. This is like 2011
Okay,
for D Rose's shoes, which is it's funny. It's a long story, but the reason that happened was not because, oh my gosh, I was some amazing basketball player. The how I got onto the first Adidas advert that I did
yeah,
was I went to the park by myself to play basketball,
yeah.
because at the time I was really invested in basketball. I really thought that, if I just keep practicing, then
You can make
one
the NBA.
day my plan was to go to America and join a Division 3 team. I'd
Mm,
worked it all out. I knew the exact schools I was going to apply to. Anyway, so yes, I would just spend a lot of time just going to the park by myself and just shooting hoops and just practicing. And one particular time I went, I noticed things were a bit odd. They'd closed off some sections. There was people with lots of heavy equipment, things like that. And then I just started talking to some random person. Next thing you know, I'm making friends with some of the extras. Soon after that, I'm now being taken to someone that from the costume department. Now I'm getting dressed in Adidas clothes. Now I'm in the background. Now I'm in the background of this shop for the advert for Derek Rose's new shoes that were coming out that year. And so none of those things happen if I don't. Two things. One, because I had that objective, I went to the buck in the first place, and I was going of my own volition, and I was just doing, probably what Seth Godin calls the practice of just going out there and making things happen anyway. But then I think when you combine that with, I was then willing to go out of my way to talk to people and make those connections and make, good friendships. I have all of their numbers, the people that I met that day, I remember their names. You just meet these random people, you talk to them, you become friends. They then introduce you to someone else who then introduces you to someone else. And now you're doing this great thing. I got paid like, I don't know if I can say, but yeah, a few £100 just for a day for showing up. Yeah, so it was good every day.
I have a question, and it's potentially controversial in that, to take the second aspect of the things that led to that outcome for you. So the first was your deliberate practice. The second was your willingness, your openness to talking to people, to meeting new people, what have you. And I think you would not be the only person in the world who got an opportunity by talking to a stranger.
Yeah.
For the first time. And part of me wonders if success, especially in the way serendipity allows, is almost stacked against or rigged in a way for people who aren't naturally outgoing, or even if they can be comfortable eventually around new people, their initial instinct is to be reserved, to shy away from conversation, to any type of, maybe not necessarily social anxiety in the diagnosed sense, but just an anxiety around new people. And if that's the case, is it that does that suggest that if you push it to the limit, to the logical conclusion, that we need to reset the world in a way that people who aren't, or is it by force they have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get talking?
I mean, I would definitely not say that. I think two things that come to mind. One also does link to something I wanted to talk about after this as well, is the first, I don't necessarily think that it limits introverts from being able to access success. Particularly now that we have things like the internet, even back in the 80s, early 90s, there's people that met in libraries, both being quiet by themselves and just noticed that each other would come and be in the same place every day, and they would both be reading the same kind of books. Then eventually you strike up a conversation because you have some familiarity, then you go on to start a business together, etc., etc. So there's lots of stories like that, or people that met while studying at university, people that ordinarily wouldn't be talkative. And even when we talk about introverts, a lot of those people still have friends. And how do they find those friends? How do they come across them? Very, very often these days, possibly on the internet. And so maybe back in Netscape days, people would have LAN parties where nerds, well, quote unquote, would come together, and you would meet people by playing games, and you would meet people online, and you'd meet people in online chat rooms. And part of the reason lots of people were there is because perhaps you didn't have the confidence to be able to just go up and strike up random conversations with people on the street in real life. But I think now there's so many forums where that can turn into future forms of serendipity. You can meet people online that can turn into some kind of opportunity. And not everything needs to be commoditized, but you can just strike up great friendships, and those can lead to fantastic things. I was listening to a podcast recently, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he ended up owning a 3-star Michelin restaurant, or even 3-star Michelin and 4-star New York Times, because that's the maximum for both. And which is an amazing story. And this guy literally came from nothing. He left home, I think, age 14, because he wanted to be a bike rider, and his parents disagreed with it. He moved in with his girlfriend, who was a few years older than him, had nothing to do, got injured when he was riding the bike, so literally had nothing, ended up going to just a local, like a bakery or restaurant, and just asked if he could help out. And the head chef there just took a liking to him, let him help out for a few years. And also because of the fact that he started at 14, by the time he's now 30, obviously he's amassed years worth of skills, and he's become, you know, a great chef, in fact. And so he ends up taking over that restaurant. I think when he first came, oh no, just in the process of him being there, it was eventually reviewed. That's how they got their first 3 Michelin stars. And then continued building, eventually bought out the existing owner of the restaurant, because I think he'd wanted to leave and the owner was like, oh, no, don't bother leaving, just buy me out and then you can have the space and creativity that you want. And so now you have this guy that's uber rich. He's the owner of like a huge, the maximum star Michelin restaurant. You can't book a seat in this place within the same calendar year. And where did that come from? It literally came from, well, I guess him leaving home, then him walking into a bakery. And I don't think that's necessarily because he was hugely extroverted. It's just the combination of the time and chance with, I guess, the practice and him finding an interest in cooking, him devoting those years to honing that craft, to becoming better at it, and capitalizing on opportunities when they presented themselves.
Yeah, you know what? It just, I guess, revised my question a little bit. Perhaps, you know, extroversion or being extroverted isn't necessarily a pivotal factor to success. I think it's probably akin to maybe a lubricant, bit of WD-40, something that eases the process, especially when human beings, real human beings, are involved in that process. But it's really interesting that you talk about the internet, and I think what it's done is that it's reduced the cost. I don't know exactly how to define the type of cost, the category of cost, but I think the social cost in terms of anxiety, in terms of confidence, in terms of charisma, charm, all these things, the cost of that has actually been diminished because anyone can type a few words into a text box and click send. It's within reason.
Yeah.
And so I guess the internet has democratized, in a way, opportunity and the chance to meet strangers. So it's not just about necessarily being outgoing in person. You can, as long as you're determined, maybe, and aware you have a bit of nouns about you, you can find the people you need instead of necessarily bumping into them on the train or in an elevator. You can make your luck in the ways people who were extrovert before in an almost different world could do. And as almost like a sort of joke, I was going to say, it's like in the internet, in the internet age, the digital age, we don't necessarily have to study line by line Dale Carnegie's How to Win and Influence People to, you know, make success, to be successful, in the sense that not to caricature the book, which is actually very useful and very helpful, but just to take that almost caricature of this very outgoing, persuasive, charming person in the flesh. You don't necessarily need to be that to make your way in the world.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other part that you touch on in terms of not needing to learn stuff is not needing to follow the rules and just being able to learn everything online is definitely something I'm a huge advocate of. YouTube is a huge resource. The internet is a huge resource because there's more stuff on the internet than you could ever read. And you could learn an infinite amount of skills just by watching and reading and listening to other people do those things. And I think what's so interesting now is that you have this proliferation of people that are essentially acting as data points for others who could be anywhere in the world. And I think this is something I was going to write about in my newsletter as well, is this idea that I came from Nigeria. I came to the UK from Nigeria as an example. And I don't think I would have been able to envisage from then what the things that I'm able to do now and the access that I'm able to have to things, etc. But I definitely think that there's people in Nigeria right now who through Twitter, who through other social spaces can see live data points of people acting out things that they might like to do. and you see these examples, you see this representation, you see people, and you're able to learn from them. Because what's interesting about the internet as well is that on the flip side of that, the tutors, the people that are sharing their knowledge and sharing their information, also gain benefit. That benefit
Yeah.
might come in the form of like reputational clout, that might come in the form of payment if you have a course, something like that, or
Sure.
it might just be goodwill. But the essence is that, you know, the people are incentivized to teach, and people also have great incentives to learn. And I think then you have these marketplaces of ideas, and you have this big mixing pot of the internet where actually information becomes so much more accessible than it ever was before. Even if you were sitting alone in your room, you could amass enough knowledge and information. People build technology companies in their room effectively by themselves. I think the founder of Ethereum, I can't even remember exactly what the process was, but he's literally, I think, 26 now. I think he was younger when he started it, or maybe he was 26 when he started it. But he essentially was upset playing World of Warcraft because they changed the rules of the game. They depowered one of his favorite skills
Sure.
in this video game that he was literally playing by himself on the internet. And he got upset about that. And then he started thinking about how unfair it is that you have centralized powers that effectively can control so much of, you know, your output. And then that eventually led to him starting Ethereum as a platform which is decentralized. And then you see all of the immense value that that's brought into the world now. But again, when we talk about serendipity, when we talk about opportunity, when we talk about all these things, that literally came from him playing a video game and having that stroke of
Yeah.
inspiration.
Sure. I would
And then
say to
also,
that.
sorry, just to add to that, I think in the process, he didn't necessarily do it all himself. In the process of him starting to build it, he could find affinity with other people, even if they weren't in the same country, but online, he could find, you know, forums and group chats and spaces where other people are discussing these ideas, and he can start interacting with them and start going on his journey of building.
I was going to say then that with the internet, it's well, it's a great thing. It's allowed what you've called this marketplace of ideas to come to fruition. It enables serendipity, and whether it's opportunities, people that you're able to connect with, or even to, so you alluded to in the World of Warcraft example, it allows your brain to have many opportunities to form different links between your synapses. If that makes sense. So if you with the internet, you have access to many different ideas, so many different forms of content, so many different potential points of convergence or divergence in terms of ideas. But I think the question I wanted to ask from the very first part of your initial of what you just kind of said was how what threat or what opportunity will the internet offer to the traditional link between traditional accreditation and, you know, recognition of skill, of ability, of talent?
I think both tremendous threat, tremendous opportunity. Threat for the old guard and the institutions and the people that make money by upholding them, and tremendous opportunity for anyone coming up anywhere in the world. The fact that you can instantly access information. I think I was telling you, even when I was studying university, half the time I was missing my own classes, but I was going to other people's classes because half the stuff's on the internet. I was in a Facebook group for Oxford freshers just because, as long as you just say, "Oh, sorry, I'm new here. Can you let me into your group?" Because I wanted the reading list, and that wasn't even for my degree. That was
Yeah.
for politics, internet, PPE,
Yeah.
and because I was interested in that, and I wanted to know what books they were reading, and I wanted to get the books. And then you buy the books on Amazon.
Yeah.
So I had psychology books, I had a bunch of books, and then now you don't even have to buy physical copies. Most of the books I listen to now are on Audible, so they're completely digital or on Kindle. Amazon now has a monopoly on all kinds of books.
Sure. Yeah.
But the point is that I never needed to take any of those courses to learn all the information. And in the same way that nobody really does now, what you might go for are for other things. And maybe this is an important thing to touch on, because I would still maintain that there are benefits to going to university, but they're
Sure.
mostly in the form of socialization. You're going to university to network and to make friends, only
Oh,
for the
okay.
sake that 10 years after you go to university, those friends will be in different places and you might be able to help each other. That's
Sure.
pretty
Sure.
much the biggest reason for going to university in my
What I
mind.
would, yeah. what I wanted to say though, I think I definitely understand that as first of all, as social beings, I think it's also great to be in a place such as university where you're surrounded by a lot of your peer group. Because I think I spent a couple of years out of university once leaving school, and as much as I had my friends from school, I didn't have that very intense pool of potential friends or just social people in your peer group and different diverse, varied interests, all that kind of stuff. So definitely on that socialization point, it's true, important. But I also think we can't deny the power of signaling, even in our digital world, even in our digital age. I think people will still look at brand names of education, of universities, even when you get into careers. I'm sure as you'll be aware, the places you've worked at, they still that you might not be as skilled as the next person, but the name, the brand name still holds signaling power in the
Mm.
labor market. So I think
But I
that's
think
what I
that
would
is
say. Mhm.
I think that's starting to change now, though. I think what's
Yeah.
happening with, we talk about the creator economy, we talk about a lot of these things. The tools have become decentralized. People now have the power to be able to create things for themselves. And if anything, now individuals are becoming the brands. And now you have
Mhm.
individuals that are able to offer courses. And by doing those courses, you are able to learn probably much of what you would learn in a 3-year degree in the span of
Mhm.
a few months. And realistically, if you can exhibit those skills, you could probably get
Mhm.
a job. Like if
Sure.
you can show, there are people that do boot camps for 4 to 6 months in
Yeah.
coding, and you come
Yeah.
out, now you can code. You can
Yeah.
code probably, if you commit with some consistency, better than someone that just spent 3 or 4 years doing a degree
Yeah.
and not
Computer
doing
science.
much outside of that. Exactly.
Mhm.
And so I think there's that balance there. But I also think there's another aspect which maybe is the inverse of what we were talking about before, in
Yeah.
terms of the benefits of, say extroversion or socialization, etc., where the internet on one hand creates this great opportunity, but I also wonder what happens to aspects of socialization, what happens
Yeah.
to networking. I
Yeah.
know that you've made some friends online. I think we all have, you
Mhm.
make friends on Twitter, you make friends on Instagram, on Clubhouse, in other spaces now. But I'm
Mhm.
really interested in what happens to our ability to socialize in the same way, particularly if we are moving towards a future where working is remote, and also further down the line,
Yeah.
potentially education is remote.
Yeah.
Because one thing with the education aspect, if a Harvard degree is completely remote, you don't need to go to Harvard. That's pretty much what it
Mhm.
comes down to,
Yeah.
unless you just were so desperate for that, the equivalent of a blue check on Twitter.
Yeah.
Um, if it's all online and you can sit at home in Pakistan and get a Harvard degree,
Yeah.
all that information is now online, and all that
Yeah.
information exists, and it's probably everywhere.
Mhm.
The other part of that, in terms of what I was saying, is that
Mhm.
I think, particularly from the working perspective, that becomes difficult. Right now, even when people could go outside, realistically, the only moments for serendipity you had, people, particularly in cities like London and New York, are very antisocial. Even when we bump into people, even when we sit on the tube together, on the train, you make journeys, you commute every day, people don't really speak to one another. Everyone's busy in their phones, you're busy in your screen. Um, and so you have this potential future where, I think I was talking recently about someone, ironically on Twitter, was talking about the idea of millennialsons, and
Okay.
using the comparison of, Nielsen is the ratings agency by which people see what, TV ratings are, who's watching
Yeah.
TV. And I
Mhm.
think the average American right now spends about 6 or 7 hours a day in front of a screen, or
Mhm.
consuming some form of entertainment when you add it all up.
Mhm.
And by contrast, they spend like 1,000th of that on hobbies or on external interests. And so you have this really interesting paradox where people are spending less and less time, not just outside, but socializing in any form. And so not making as many friends in real life, but people are making friends online. And while
Yeah.
that's a good thing, I also think that there's the perspective that you lose a lot of the other aspects of socialization,
Yeah.
that come with human contact, which is probably the
Yeah.
biggest point. I think there was a company that just raised over 200 million that it's like therapy, but it's people that like give you hugs, things like that. So there's a lot of people, and also I heard that they were having hugging parties in New York. You hear
Hugging
about things
party.
like that. Yeah,
Okay.
people are missing like human contact. People are
Yeah.
missing that aspect. So as much as you still get to talk to people online and you still
Mm,
get to do these things, there's the
mhm,
potential where, you know, if the average person is spending about 6 or 7 hours a day
mm,
on entertainment, then you're spending another 8 hours a day on work, then you just have multiple screens for different things. So you have your phone, this is the screen that you use to talk to your friends. Then
mm,
you turn to another screen and you do your whole work day on that screen. Then you turn to another screen, your TV, and you have your evening
mm.
entertainment on that screen. And so you spend your whole day just rotating between different screens for different purposes.
Yeah.
And really, through none of those things do you get a lot of the externalities that happen when you
Yeah.
speak to people and engage with people in real life.
Yeah. I was going to say, I feel there are kind of two aspects of this kind of new world we live in, this world of screens. So there's obviously a neurological aspect in the sense of I feel as if your neurology, the way your brain works and handles, say, distraction or stimuli will literally change as you. I mean, it's not natural. By natural, I mean it's not how to use kind of evolutionary terms or evolutionary science. That's not how we live life. Um, Back then or before the advent of technology. So I think that kind of neurological changes and phone addiction is actually quite perverse. And I haven't got it now, but if you there's a book which I read called Breaking Up with Your Phone, and it had a link to a phone addiction questionnaire. Now, me, I would consider myself the average, as well as as much as I may admit that I'm addicted to my phone. I would consider myself pretty much average for at least this generation, this millennial Gen Z generation. And it would ask me questions such as in the survey, do you check your phone the very first thing you do before bed? Do you check your phone uh, when you wake up? Now, these questions are actually quite prosaic in Gen Z millennial culture. Even for some people outside of that bracket who kind of socialized in the way to use technology and need and depend on it. So these very prosaic questions are actually, if you answer yes to those questions, you actually have the beginnings of severe phone addiction. But it's so normalized. So that's kind of to speak to the neurology of it. But then another aspect is the way communication, socialization. And the reason I want to touch on this is because you're talking about communicating, about texting, about messaging, all these things over the internet. If you break down communication, which yes, it's a statistic that's been used to death, but I think it's actually quite relevant here. Words provide 7% of human communication. The rest comes in tone, and an even greater proportion comes in non-verbal communication, which is things that you perceive to some extent through video, but really and truly, I think you perceive it in the highest definition in person, in the physical. Now, these things are lost if we spend the majority of our lives on screens, but also communicating through screens. So it's potentially you could argue that our brains are changing immeasurably from what is quote unquote natural, and the way we communicate is also hampered and limited from what is natural. So it's I'm not sure if it's something to look forward to, something to be scared of, what the new natural kind of neurological and social kind of stance on the way we communicate and be human will be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it'll be a really interesting future. My main thought right now is effectively that we just forget it. We get so used to the new norm of the level at which we can communicate and empathize now that we
Mm,
forget how much we used to be able to do before. There's
mm,
another study. I keep saying, random studies. I don't remember all the names, but
yeah.
there was a study I remember where, in talking about the effect of phones. Actually, there's a few I can think of, but one was just they sent some Boy Scouts into the woods. You know, they had a control group and a normal group, and one group wasn't allowed to have their phones, and obviously they gave them some questions before and afterwards to gauge their empathy, how well they, you know, played well with others, how well they interacted
Yeah.
with others, their level of socialization, things like that. And when you measure before and after, the group that went through those days without their phones grew tremendously in all of those areas. And so by not having their phones, they were forced to talk to each other more, they were forced to socialize a bit more. And so it's interesting how profound that impact becomes. But I do think that simultaneously, a lot of people are very unaware about the extent to which their phone currently impacts their life. And there's a lot of people that are in denial. And a lot of people say, you know, the addicts are just other people, but it's not me. It couldn't be me. I'm just, you know, one of the normal ones. I just use my phone when I need to, etc. And again, I've written about this in my newsletter, but there's several studies where they can effectively break down like how much the mere presence of your phone detracts from your enjoyment of other things. So there's one study, for example, where parents took their kids to the science museum, and then when they asked parents afterwards, so there were some kids where some parents where they told them intentionally, just don't bring your phone or put your phone away, and there were some where they just let them do what they want. The parents that had their phones, even if they didn't think that they were on them, remembered less about this day that they spent with their children and rated their enjoyment of it as lower. A similar study, the scientists effectively gave people money and said, you know, go out, go have dinner with your friends and your family. And again, similarly, the group that they told, okay, just make sure you put your phone away while you're having this dinner, when they rated how much they enjoyed that dinner, well, two things. One, how much did you enjoy the food that you ate? And two, how much did you enjoy, you know, the overall night, the company, etc. In both of those things, they rated them higher when they didn't have their phones.
Wow.
So somehow the food that you're eating tastes better when you don't have, even when you're not necessarily on it, but even if it's on the table in front of you, when it's visible or the presence of it is there, somehow that detracts from your, I think it's because it's a distraction, and it's the anticipation of a distraction, because you're always thinking, something may have come. Is something coming? Is, you know, you hear a slight vibration, which could be completely phantom. Was that my phone ringing? And so there's this constant thing that's drawing your attention away from other things that you could be focusing on. And focus is one of those things that we just don't think about a lot. Again, I keep referencing studies, but there's another one on focus that I found really interesting where I can't remember the tasks that they asked people to do, but they asked them to do a task on a computer where effectively, I think maybe they were like typing an email or something on the computer, and they had their phones with them. And those people that had their phones didn't see that a red cross kept flashing in the center of the screen that they were staring at. So they were supposed to be doing a task. That the presence of their phones didn't necessarily mean that they couldn't complete the task or did it any slower. But what it did mean is that they weren't able to recognize or notice other things that were happening at the same time.
Do you know what is I think what I want to talk about is just technology in general, but just to reference another study in the chain of studies today, is a 2012 study by McKinsey showed that the average worker spends 60% of their time on online communication tools and stuff on the web, and only 30% of their time actually answering and responding to emails. I think that just kind of shows how might not necessarily just be phones, but the way technology and the communication, the social engagement that it permits is kind of invading our productivity. And whether it's focus, whether it's enjoyment, it's very evasive. And what I wanted to, a few comments I wanted to make now would just be on almost the way that technology is rigged for these negative effects. So the one is, for example, the mobile phone. The phone is not just a distraction. It's been described, I forget by who, as a super distraction because it puts a variety of much wanted, much desired distractions into one place, and it literally becomes in itself, it epitomizes and holds so much power to distract because it literally multiplies distractions on each other. it's almost like there are externalities with distraction. You pick up your phone, go to one app, there's another notification. That it snowballs quite quickly into almost disastrously distracting you from whatever it is you need to do. And another aspect of kind of technology that I wanted to talk about was that success within technology, as in selling technology to consumers, actually depends very explicitly on making consumers addicted to their products, as in literally behavioral, and I'm sure you'll know this, cognitive scientists, behavioral specialists literally consult on the creation of tech products, or at the very least, their work is consulted to develop these apps. So not only does your phone and other technologies contain distractions, these distractions have been highly fine-tuned, developed in the lab to be as distracting as possible and as addictive as
Yeah.
possible. So it's a very almost just weird, almost dystopian world which we live in, where the things that have caused our advancement are almost deliberately designed to destroy us, or at least to
Yeah.
distract us, of um, of lacking focus and enjoyment and productivity in our various aspects of life.
I do completely agree with that. But I also do think there's an extent to which we also need to take some responsibility for our
As
own distraction
individuals,
as well.
yeah,
Yeah, I
okay.
do think we should. Because I think it becomes increasingly easy to blame just nebulous
The
companies
world,
somewhere in the
yeah,
ether.
yeah.
Yeah. And then in your day-to-day life, you just continue to ignore the fact that it's having severe impacts on, whether it's your relationship with your friends, your relationship with your family, your relationship with your work, the things that you need to do.
Sure.
So Ner Ayal, I think that's how you pronounce his name, has a book called
Oh,
Indistractable, which is really good. And I referenced it
oh,
in something I was writing in my newsletter.
okay.
And I think it was him, or perhaps it was someone else actually, but was making the point that I think one thing that people make the mistake of is that people think that the opposite of being distracted is to focus. And that's not the case. Like the opposite of distraction is traction. Traction is
Mhm.
forward progress towards a goal, whereas distraction is something that's drawing you away from what you're supposed to be doing. And so it's not really enough just to focus. You really have to be able to hack in the same way that your phone or these things might be hacking your attention. Similarly, you need to be able to hack those tools and hack your own attention to positive ends to get the things that you need to do done. I think another just underrated idea is the fact that your attention is one of the biggest assets that you have. It's so expensive. When you think about how much companies are spending and
It's literally,
investing
I was
to
gonna say,
buy
yeah,
your attention and your time.
yeah. Just to be on that point, many people don't quite understand that social media, you are not the customer. The customer are these businesses, and the currency is you and your attention. If that makes
Mm.
sense. I'm just
Yeah,
just
exactly.
yeah.
So these companies are paying, tooth and nail for your attention, and you're freely giving it to them when you could, ramp up the cost by making it a bit harder, or trying to focus on other things and
Mhm.
finding tractions for the things you actually want to get done. But to
Yeah,
wrap up, what are
sure.
your final thoughts on, I guess, I mean, we've talked a lot. We've gone from talking about, doing your best work. We've talked about the
Mhm.
opportunities for serendipity on the internet.
Sure.
We've talked about, I guess, the balance between, on one hand, the internet provides a wealth of opportunity to be able to
Mhm.
access opportunities, to be able to access ideas, but then simultaneously, our phones and devices and screens are also pulling us away from the ability to empathize with each other, the ability to
Mhm.
communicate effectively.
Mhm. Final thoughts. I think I would anchor it in almost a broader vision that an individual has to have for themselves. I think you need to decide what deserves your attention, what deserves your focus, what deserves your optimal performance. And in that way, you'll be able to kind of navigate and make those important decisions and calls into how you kind of navigate this. It's almost like, yeah, it's the landmines in the sense of it's this land of opportunity, land of prosperity, but there are literal landmines of distraction, and all these things. And the best way to navigate those and still kind of have some sort of success however you define it, is just to have a bigger picture of the work that's important to you and to value your attention. I think we've almost got to a stage, just to pick up on the last things you said, that companies value our attention more than we do. That makes sense. Whether and when that should be the opposite way around, because our attention is what allows us to achieve fulfillment in our lives, whereas our attention for these companies is just a paycheck. Does that make sense? So yeah, that's what I think I've gotten away from. I've gotten from this very interesting discussion we've had today.
Yeah, the last thought that I had, which may be tangential, it might not be. We'll see what comes out of my mouth.
Sure.
But just in terms of the importance or the outcomes of, when you have this tremendous focus on your ability to execute, and this going back full circle, your ability to have tremendous performance, it reminds me of Michael Phelps as an example. His race day routine starts from first thing in the morning, and it's meticulous. So the playlist that he listens to the exact same songs at the exact same time on every day that he's swimming, every day that he's racing. He will eat at the exact same time. He'll stay in the exact same kind of place. Everything will be prepared. And so in his mind, this is all routine. And that routine ends with him winning the race, like right from the beginning of the day, right down until not just the swim, but him winning. That is part of his routine. And so it's interesting how, through cultivating that focus, cultivating that traction, you're then able to reach, I guess, your peak in some ways. But yeah, awesome. Thanks for coming.
Always, I'm glad to be here. Glad for the invite. Thank you.